Alright, Shalom, this is Yahweh Kanan coming in with another GMS Motivation. And this one would be Shalom Akim. This week motivation is ethnic tension will escalate. Look up articles displaying omen pivotal points within this time that show the ethnic tension rising, filtering with scriptures. So what I'm going into today is nationalism, which I didn't know what it was. I met a guy, but it explains itself. So it's basically nationalism. Show you how nationalism is going to bring in that attention and how it's already here, and you got rhythms of it being played out. It's a nationalism is a multi-dimensional concept reflecting in the community identification with one's nation. It is a political ideology oriented towards gaining and maintaining self-governance or full sovereignty over a territory of historical significance to a group such as its homeland. Nationalism therefore holds that a nation should govern itself free from unwanted outside interferences, and is linked to the concept of self-determination. Nationalism is future origin towards development and maintaining a national identity based on shared characteristics such as culture, language, race, religion, political goals, or a belief in a common ancestry. Nationalism therefore seeks to preserve the nation culture. It often also involves a sense of pride in the nation's achievements and is closely linked to the concept of pessimism. Is in these terms, nationalism can be considered positive or negative. In some case, it means that a nation should be able to control and govern in all means of production. So that's what it is. Damn, I got the wrong motherfucker. Oh, okay. Which this is a crash course in world history, which is going to tell you what it is, which is the same thing that I'm doing, nationalism. I got a commercial.
Turn feelings into jewelry. It could be a piece designers create just for Jared, or a piece we custom make just for you, because we're more than a jewelry store.
This is kind of long, but it's going to break down what nationalism is and give you the history.
And in competition with the West. So the Meiji government established a functioning tax system. They built public infrastructure like harbors and telegraph.
Sorry about that. Started from the beginning. Satan was going to do that.
We're going to talk about nationalism, the most important global phenomenon of the 19th century, and also the phenomenon responsible for one of the most commented upon aspects of Crash Course, my globes being out of date. USSR not a country. Rhodesia? South Vietnam? Sudan with no South Sudan? Yugoslavia? Okay, no more inaccuracies with the globes. Oh, the little globes! This one doesn't know about Slovakia, this one has East Frak in Pakistan, and this one identifies Lithuania as part of Asia. Okay, no more globe inaccuracies. Actually, bring back my globes. I feel naked without them. So if you're into European history, you're probably somewhat familiar with nationalism and the names and countries associated with it. Bismarck in Germany, Mazzini and Garibaldi in Italy, and Mustafa Kemal, aka Ataturk, in Turkey. But nationalism was a global phenomenon, and it included a lot of people you may not associate with it, like Muhammad Ali in Egypt, and also this guy. Nationalism was seen in the British dominions as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand became federated states between 1860 and 1901. I would say independent states instead of federated states, but you guys still have a queen. It was also seen seen in the Balkans, where Greece gained its independence in 1832 and Christian principalities fought a war against the Ottomans in 1878. In India, where a political party, the Indian National Congress, was founded in 1885. And even in China, where nationalism ran up against a dynastic system that had lasted more than 2,000 years. And then, of course, there are these guys, who in many ways represent the worst of nationalism. The nationalism that tries to deny or eliminate difference in the efforts to create a homogenous, mythologized, unitary polity. We'll get to them later, but it's helpful to bring them up now just so we don't get too excited about nationalism. Okay, so before we launch into the history, let's define the modern nation-state. Definitions are slippery, but for our purposes, a nation-state involves a centralized government that can claim and exercise authority over a distinctive territory. That's the state part. It also involves a certain degree of linguistic and cultural homogeneity. That's the nation part. Mr. Green, by that definition, China was a nation-state by, like, probably the Han Dynasty. Dude, me from the past, you're getting smart. Yeah, it could be, and some historians argue that it was. Nationhood is really hard to define. Like in James Joyce's Ulysses, the character Bloom famously says that a nation is the same people living in the same place, but then he remembers the Irish and Jewish diasporas and adds, or also living in different places. But let's ignore diasporas for the moment and focus on territorially bounded groups with a common heritage. Same people, same place. So how do you become a nation? Well, some argue it's an organic process involving culturally similar people wanting to formalize their connections. Others argue that nationalism is constructed by governments, building a sense of patriotism through compulsory military service and statues of national heroes. Public education is often seen as part of this nationalizing project. Schools and textbooks allow countries to share their nationalizing narratives, which is why the once and possibly future independent nation of Texas issues textbooks literally whitewashing early American history. Still, other historians argue that nationalism was an outgrowth of urbanization and
Exactly, and I'm gonna highlight that point. I'm glad he brought that out to show you how even in the 21st century that what you see is happening in America under the Trump administration and throughout the 50 states is nationalism. That's why in Texas, he threw that joke in there real quick, but that's why they took slavery out of the textbooks, and you had that fucking nigga, Ben Carson, actually go up there and get that speech on how we came over here as employees. You fucking asshole. But yeah, make sure you catch that. So you actually watching nationalism happen right in front of your face.
Industrialization, since new urbanites were the most likely people to want to see themselves as part of a nation. For instance, Prague's population rose from 157,000 to 514,000 between 1850 and 1900, at the same time that the Czechs were beginning to see themselves as separate from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Which is a cool idea, but it doesn't explain why other less industrialized places like India also saw a lot of nationalism. The actual business of nationalization involves creating bureaucracies, new systems of education, building a large military, and often using that military to fight other nation states, since nations often construct themselves in opposition to an idea of otherness. A big part of being Irish, for instance, is not being English. So emerging nations had a lot of conflicts, including the Napoleonic Wars, which helped the French become the French, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which helped Indians to identify themselves as a homogenous people, the American Civil War. I mean, before the Civil War, many Americans thought of themselves not as Americans, but as Virginians, or New Yorkers, or Pennsylvanians. I mean, our antebellum nation was usually called these United States, after it became the United States. So in the US, nationalism pulled a nation together, but often nationalism was a destabilizing force for multi-ethnic land-based empires. This was especially the case in the Ottoman Empire, which started falling apart in the 19th century as first the Greeks, then the Serbs, Romanians, and Bulgarians, all predominantly Christian people, began clamoring for, and in some cases winning, independence. Egypt is another good example of nationalism serving both to create a new state and to weaken an empire. Muhammad Ali, who was actually Albanian and spoke Turkish, not Egyptian Arabic, and his ruling family encouraged the Egyptian people to imagine themselves as a separate nationality. But okay, so nationalism was a global phenomenon in the 19th century, and we can't talk about it everywhere, so instead, we're going to focus on one case study. Japan. You thought I was going to say Germany, didn't you? Nope, you can bite me, Bismarck. Japan had been fragmented and feudal until the late 16th century, when a series of warrior landowners managed to consolidate power. Eventually, power came to the Tokugawa family, who created a military government, or bakufu. The first Tokugawa to take power was Ieyasu, who took over after the death of one of the main unifiers of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, sometimes known as the Monkey, although his wife called him, and this is true, the Bald Rat. In 1603, Ieyasu convinced the...
Which he actually was a Israelite. He was a Judite. For those of y'all who don't know.
emperor who was something of a figurehead to grant him the title of shogun. And for the next 260 years or so, the Tokugawa Bakufu was the main government of Japan. The primary virtue of this government was not necessarily its efficiency or its forward-thinking policies, but its stability. Stability, the most underrated of governmental virtues. Let's go to the thought bubble. The Tokugawa Bakufu wasn't much for centralization, as power was mainly in the hands of local lords called daimyo. One odd feature of the Tokugawa era was the presence of a class of warriors who by the 19th century had become mostly bureaucrats. You may have heard of them, the samurai. One of the things that made this hereditary class so interesting was that each samurai was entitled to an annual salary from the daimyo called a stipend. This privilege basically paid them off and assured that they didn't become restless warriors plaguing the countryside, that is, bandits. We tend to think of samurai as noble and honorable, but urban samurai, according to Andrew Gordon's book A Modern History of Japan, were a rough and tumble lot. Samurai gang wars, a West Side Story, and the shadows of Edo Castle were frequent in the early 1600s. And you still say that history books are boring. As with kings and lesser nobles anywhere, the central Bakufu had trouble controlling the more powerful daimyo, who were able to build up their own strength because of their control over local resources. This poor control also made it really difficult to collect taxes, so the Tokugawa were already a bit on the ropes when two foreign events rocked Japan. First was China's humiliating defeat in the Opium Wars, after which Western nations forced China to give Europeans special trade privileges. It was a wake-up call to see the dominant power in the region so humbled, but even worse for the Tokugawa was the arrival of Matthew Perry. No, thought bubble, Matthew Perry. Yes, that one. The Tokugawa are somewhat famous for their not-so-friendly policy toward foreigners, especially Western Christian ones, for whom the penalty for stepping foot on the graduation hat.
Nationalism.
Thanks, Meredith the intern, for letting me borrow your graduation hat. Dear Public Education, when you were introduced in Japan, you were very unpopular because you were funded by a new property tax. In fact, you were so unpopular that at least 2,000 schools were destroyed by rioters, primarily through arson. Stan, it doesn't look good when you bring it in close like that. I look like a 90-year-old swimmer. And even though public education has proved extremely successful, lots of people still complain about having to pay taxes for it. So let me explain something. Public education does not exist for the benefit of students or for the benefit of their parents. It exists for the benefit of the social order. We have discovered as a species that it is useful to have an educated population. You do not need to be a student or have a child who is a student to benefit from public education. Every second of every day of your life you benefit from public.
Right, because the social order that he's speaking on, that it's not beneficial for your kids or for the parents, is because the social order that they work for is actually called the elites. That's who own these corporations, who your kid get trained to learn how to just function at their jobs. That's what the whole school system was set up, and that's where they also get to teach nationalism to your kid at the same time. Because the whiteys want their power back. Okay, I'm gonna go to the third video. White nationalists, so you can get introduced to the guy in America who's pushing it. What's his name? Richard Spears. Well, he finna say it. But this on Al Jazeera, because he making waves and they growing rapidly. So y'all got to know about these guys. Al Jazeera. And I'm going to let him tell you, and you tell me if you don't notice this going on around anywhere you at in America.
Well, I object to being called a white supremacist.
You coined the term alt-right. Do you object to being called a white supremacist?
Well, I object to being called a white supremacist because it's simply not true. A white supremacist would want to lord over other races or control over the races and so on. I am not a white supremacist. I do object to that. Not only is it just a slur word, but it's not accurate.
But you do think that white culture should be supreme in the United States?
I think in the United States was defined by Anglo-Protestants, certainly at the beginning, but particularly after the Civil War, it was defined by this big European family. So America is a white country in terms of its rooted historical identity. Now, things can change. In what direction are we headed? I think we're headed towards obviously a multiracial America, a multicultural America, probably a fragmenting America, probably something that's going to be totally unrecognizable.
Which is what you seen them speaking about in Japan before they brought nationalism back.
I think obviously history can change course if people are dedicated enough and their ideas are powerful enough. So Yes. I mean, America historically is undoubtedly a white country. We're headed in a very different direction.
What about the term neo-Nazi?
No, we're not a neo-Nazi. We're not the KKK. We're not any of that stuff. The reason why we have power is precisely because we are rooted in the current year, 2016. Like, think about a college student coming out of Texas A&M or wherever. They're graduating. They have $100,000 in student loan debt. They have no career prospects outside of Starbucks. And they look at every major institution, from the government to massive corporations to the military. They all are geared towards diversity. So they're all geared towards not hiring white people and not hiring white males in particular.
That's not true, though. They hire plenty of white people.
Of course
The
they hire
diversity
plenty.
is there to try to give opportunities to people who had been underrepresented previously.
At the moment, in many of these corporations, white people are actually underrepresented. At major Silicon Valley corporations, white males are underrepresented, absolutely, as a percentage of the national population. And it's more
that's
about,
a
you have to
lie.
think about
They make up
where's the
43%.
arrow pointed towards. The arrow is not pointed towards traditional America. The arrow is pointed towards not hiring them. So, again, if a new Hollywood movie comes out, oh, isn't this great that there are less white people in the cast of this comic book film? Maybe the new James Bond.
That's why Trump ran under that "Let's Make America Great Again." That's what that slogan means.
Should be black. We talked about that for a whole year. Oh, isn't it great if this new CEO is an Indian or a non-white person? The arrow is pointed against white identity. It's pointed against white people defining America culturally and socially.
And just to show you how they're using all tools at their disposal. They actually got, because they're using propaganda too. Not only is they using literature, and they're using economics, and they're using religion and so forth, but they using propaganda too through the TV. I'm finna show it to you. That's why you have shows like this popping up to put the ideology into your mind frame, but not just theirs, but to all nations. It's called Hate Thy Neighbor. If any of y'all not familiar with this show, you should check it out. Now when you go on here, what groups is on there? American Far Right. See, this is how they going about doing it. Which I should play a little bit of it, my bad. American Far Right. It's a Jamel travels to meet members of the National Socialist Movement, the largest neo-Nazi group in America, who openly idolize Adolf Hitler and endorse all things white power. That's what it's all about. But then when you go to 2, you got what? Hunting the White Devil. Jamal heads to Harlem and meets with black separatists who believe they descended from the 12 tribes of Israel, which is ISUPK. And then you even got in the Ukraine. They're doing the same thing over in Europe, fighting a war on its own soil. Why? Because they got a far-right militant group who's basically who got neo-Nazi roots, but they trying to keep out those immigrants that's fleeing from Syria and the war that's going on. Well, I ain't got to talk about them. The Arabs and the Jews been fighting. But as you can see, these shows right here is to propagandally put it in your mind and justify how you feel. Then they got other organizations popping up, like Black Lives Matter. They also got the KKK coming back, and they also got the Black Panthers. So these are your groups, and the Latins got actually movements too. Is it AIM? I forgot the Latins ones. I should have looked theirs up too.
So we did, and this is where we are. This is probably the most important thing happening in the world today, because this is happening not just in the United States. If you look at Germany, I actually spent a lot of time in
other
Germany
countries that's going
more
on.
than a decade ago. I was a student. And one thing that I loved about it, that it was actually a more traditional place in the United States. There seemed to be smaller, more closely knit communities and nice little churches and so on. I loved it. when you see images of after the Syrian refugee crisis, just these waves
Exactly what I
of
was just
people
talking
coming in,
about.
you just see that this country is being radically
I think I said
transformed.
Libya. It's Syria.
That this transformation of societies and cultures is the most important thing happening today. I mean, you could call it the Great Erasure. I mean, it is a radical transformation of the white world. And because this is happening, because we feel it, everyone feels
See
it.
that? Can't
That's why
deny
the
this.
alt-right is powerful, because it's so true. What we're saying rings true. What we're saying cuts right to the heart of the matter. And that's why people are attracted to us. That's why we're growing.
You're also getting a lot of pushback, a lot of people who aren't attracted, and a lot of people who are concerned. You say you're not a neo-Nazi, you say you don't condone violence, but then you say, "Hail Trump," and have your followers doing Nazi salutes. You use a German word to describe the Jewish-owned media in the United States. Can you understand?
Media.
I believe there was some anti-Semitic references in that speech.
picked up on.
Perhaps I'm wrong, but can you understand how people might be threatened by that kind of activity and that kind of language?
Yes, in a way they should be afraid, because we are changing the paradigm. There are
Exactly.
many people who benefit from the current paradigm. They don't want it to change.
Okay, so you know that Donald Trump recently told the New York Times that he disavows your movement, that he doesn't want to energize your movement. Do you believe him? Is it too late for him to say that?
I don't think Donald Trump really knows a lot about the alt-right. But to be honest, it's fine that Donald Trump distanced himself, because the alt-right is still the alt-right. The alt-right is a vanguard. The alt-right is not the Trump cheerleading squad. And I'll grant you that, yes, we were kind of like that during the campaign. But the campaign's over, and now Trump is in office. Now Trump has to make decisions that have a real impact. So we need to be willing to criticize him. I mean, there's a degree to which he wants to distance himself from us. We want to distance ourselves from him. We want to push him in the right direction. If Donald Trump does not change American foreign policy, and I think he will, but if he does not change American foreign policy, if he does not ultimately address the immigration question, then I will view him as a failure.
I guess traditional conservatives, when you talk about immigration, the big concern has been illegal immigration, but you're against
You're
legal
talking about the
immigration.
Northern Kingdom.
The illegal
starting with
immigration is not
Issachar, right?
really the problem.
But
I mean,
they
I
also
support
been
a crackdown.
But they also been deporting Benjamin, which is Jamaicans, and they've been deporting Levite Haitians. So it ain't just no Issachar Mexican thing. They also been deporting the other brothers from the other tribes too at the same time. But that's going unnoticed in the news media. But it's real life in those communities that's happening. So that's why us occupants of GMS, which is here to shine a light and profess the truth and let our people know what's happening and what's coming, and see it for yourself. Because a lot of y'all don't know what nationalism is. Y'all don't know anything about this. But they all around you, and they're in a lot of top government fields. Like you got Paul Ryan, that's from Wisconsin and so forth, and Scott Walker. With Paul Ryan, he's the Speaker of the House right now, and from Wisconsin. So y'all better get y'all mind right.
I support the wall. But at the end of the day, that is not the real issue. The real issue is the demographic change that's occurring through legal immigration. And that is, these people come, they're here.
See, he said the geographical change that's happening through the legal process. So they don't even care that the Latins can be legally over here and get their citizenship.